All right, so let's go ahead and just continue on the next procedure. So let's revisit the logical structure of a hypothesis test. You've already practiced writing the hypothesis test. So writing just the hypothesis, H0 and H1. From there, you have to actually collect a sample. And again, that's going to be given to you. And then from the sample, you'll compare it to your sampling distribution. But then you need to go ahead and determine, does your sample support or contradict the assumptions in step 1 and 2? So the language that is used is actually very precise, and it means something. So let me actually take some time here to just practice the language. So because your sample is evidence for or against the alternative claim, we got to be careful with the language that we use because we're not actually proving. So we are not proving anything. We're not proving anyone is correct, whether H0 or H1 is correct. We're just saying there's evidence that says that this could be correct. And so there's no way to prove any of that because all of our claims are based on probabilities. And we're never 100% certain. So we're never going to accept the null. We're never going to say, oh, yeah, you're right. The mean is exactly 2. We're never really going to accept the null or the alternative. We're simply going to say it looks like, H0 could be true or it looks like H1 could be true. And that's about it. So it's really important for you to essentially say when you reach a conclusion, you're going to either. So when you reach a conclusion, you're either going to reject H0 or you're going to fail to reject. Yeah, this looks funky. That kind of looks like a H0. So fail to reject the null. And notice, we're never saying we accept the null or we accept the alternative. We're just saying we reject the null or we fail to reject the null. So did your sample show evidence for this? If it is, you're going to say, I reject the null. I don't think this is true. If you get a sample that lands, somewhere here where you did not expect to land, you're not going to say that the center is correct. We're just going to say we fail to reject the null. Okay, so please make sure that you also use that language. So whenever you have to reach a conclusion, it's going to be reject H0 or fail to reject H0. However, there's something, a conclusion, and then there's an interpretation. When you interpret, always make sure that you do it in terms of, in reference to the alternative. So when you conclude, you're only going to be talking about H0. And we'll practice that right now, okay? So only talk about H0. But when you're trying to interpret, like summarizing the results of your test, you're only going to reference H1. So you're going to say, I have sufficient evidence to say the mean is greater than 2. I have sufficient evidence to say blah, 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 blah. Or you're going to say, I have insufficient evidence to say the mean is greater than 2. Okay, so always with respect to H1. So let's go ahead and just practice. So I know this kind of might seem strange because I want you to use very precise language. But part of that is because, again, we're not proving anything and we're not really showing anything. We're just saying we believe that this is correct based on my sample. So my sample has evidence to back up this claim. And that's all that we're going to say. Okay. So this is a very famous analogy. Let's go ahead and just work through this because it's going to be an analogy that we're going to come back to later when we talk about errors, types of errors. It's a little more difficult talking about errors and to appreciate exactly what's going on until if you do that before you do any full examples. So I'm going to do the error and the power of a test at the very end. So once we get through all the hypothesis tests, chapter 10, so that'll be something that you look at next week. All right, so here's a quick example. In the United States, we assume that an individual accused of a crime is innocent until proven guilty. If the case goes to trial, the defendant can present evidence to clear their name while the prosecutor presents evidence to support the claim that they're guilty of committing the crime. So notice that there's actually two competing hypotheses here. So what is the null hypothesis? The null hypothesis, according to this, in the United States, we assume that this is true. So the defendant is innocent. We're going to assume that everyone's innocent. Then the alternative is that the defendant is, so this is what we're trying to show, is guilty. Okay, so innocent and guilty. So something important is going to happen. I'm pretty sure we've all seen movies or TV shows where they're reading a verdict, and it always sounds the same. They say, we find the defendant let's say that they find the defendant guilty. Notice how this is in terms of the alternative. They're talking about guilt. This person is guilty. We find the defendant guilty. If this is their conclusion, in other words, their interpretation, then we know that the hypothesis test, that the evidence, when it was presented, the jury found that they were able to reject the null. So here they reject the null. So they're going to go ahead and find the defendant guilty. So now in everyday language, you're going to phrase it in terms of the alternative hypothesis. Now, let's say that they don't reject. So they fail to reject. So if they fail to reject the null, it means that evidence was presented. And again, they were not convinced. They were not able to reach, they were not able to reject this claim, H0, that the defendant is innocent. Okay, so again, always you reject or fail to reject H0, always. Then you interpret that with respect to guilty. So you're going to say, we find the defendant. Now, something interesting happens here. Always talk about H1. Because if you are not able to reject H0, it doesn't automatically mean that the person is innocent. So you're not going to say we find them innocent. You're going to say the evidence wasn't convincing enough for me to say that this person is guilty. So I'm just going to say we find the defendant not guilty. Okay, so we're never really going to refer back to H0 when we're describing it in words. We will say my hypothesis test, the result is reject H0 or fail to reject. But then in words, we want to make sure. So again, here it's always H0. In words, it's always H1. Okay, and there is a reason why. So let's just go ahead and practice this a little more. So again, possible conclusion, always in terms of H0. But when you're interpreting, always with respect to H1. So the language of the conclusion will always be reject or fail to reject. So one or the other. And then depending on which one it is, you're basically going to say, oh, we find that there actually is evidence to make the claim that I was after. Or you're going to say, I don't have evidence. I don't have enough evidence to support the claim that I was trying to make. So you never admit defeat. You never are going to say you're wrong. You're just going to say, I have sufficient evidence to say I'm correct, or I have insufficient evidence to say that I'm correct, right? To support my claim. So let's go ahead and try this out. Example 2, Domino's Pizza has a mean delivery time of 58 minutes. So notice they talk about mean and delivery time. So that's quantitative. And so therefore, I know that we're talking about mu, the mean delivery time for Domino's. The claim is that mu is 58. All right, so what's the alternative? We think that the time has reduced now, or at least we want that to be the case because we're pretty hungry. So we're going to say, well, we think that mu is now less than 58. All right, so we practice setting this up. We also practice doing the sketch. And you've already seen how to get the test statistic, but here our interest is now in the interpretation part. So let's focus on the interpretation piece. Let's say that my sample evidence indicates that the null hypothesis is rejected. So let's go ahead and write that out in words. If the null hypothesis is rejected, then you're going to say your conclusion is reject H0. We have evidence to put a little X next to this, like, no, we don't believe that. So again, you're going to refer to H1. So what is that you have shown? We have evidence. In other words, you have sufficient evidence to support the claim that mu is less than 50. So always tell me what mu represents. That's why I always write out the parameter. Mu in this case is the mean delivery time for Domino's. I'm just going to say delivery time is less than 58 minutes. And that's it. So I've summarized the results of the hypothesis test, and I also go ahead and state my conclusion, always in terms of the alternative. All right, let's move on to part C. Now, suppose that sample evidence now indicates that the null hypothesis should not be rejected. So in other words, we really want to reject the null, but we're saying, oh no, we failed. We're not rejecting the null hypothesis. So we failed to put that little X on there. We're like, oh no. And so unfortunately, the evidence wasn't convincing enough for us to reject H0. So we're going to go ahead and say we fail to reject the null hypothesis. And now we can come to a conclusion in words. So we're going to say we have insufficient evidence to, and you're basically going to write the same thing. Okay, so that underline is essentially H1. And so there you have it. That is how we will be interpreting our results. So we fail to reject H0. That means we have insufficient evidence to support the claim that the mean delivery time is less than 58 minutes. All right, that's pretty much it. So we have another example here for you to try. So go ahead and try it out. You're going to essentially summarize the results of the hypothesis test. Do you reject or fail to reject? Then you need to summarize this, come to a conclusion in words about the original problem statement. In other words, the hypothesis. Okay, so give this a shot. This one's kind of nice because it should be relevant to you.